The parallels between its current sports festival and Naruto's Chunin exams are staggering. You know, someone should make a video about that when the arc is over. 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 When the arc is over.
Well, better late than never, I guess. The tournament arc is a staple of Shounen Jump, and for good reason. A tournament can be an effective tool in tying up old plot threads while simultaneously creating new ones, and due to its simplistic nature, it can fit into just about any story. Not everyone can relate to a demon mist swordsman or blood-ingesting paralyzation man, but everyone knows how a tournament works. Most of the time. There are an endless number of possibilities with a tournament, but this leaves as much room for failure as it does success, despite the fact that each series that uses this element typically strives to achieve something fundamentally different. Comparisons to its contemporaries and statements about how such and such did it better will inevitably spring up anyway. That's why I've taken it upon myself to compare and contrast a few of these arcs to see where their respective strengths and weaknesses lie. And, seeing how the initial plot structure of My Hero Academia already parallels that of early Naruto, I figured that would be as good of a place as any to start. Now, the Naruto wiki divides the story differently than I do, so I want to clarify that I will be discussing the material covered between chapters 34 and 139 of the manga. Operation Destroy Konoha always felt like it was part of the Chunin exams, at least to me, since Orochimaru was a focal point in the Forest of Death. Furthermore, the exam arc begins with the introduction of Gaara and his allies, so naturally, the arc would conclude after Naruto fights Gaara. Beyond that, it just doesn't make sense in the context of this story for the Chunin exams arc to conclude midway through the exam itself, leaving the main goal of the arc both unaddressed and unresolved. Thankfully, My Hero Academia doesn't have this issue, as its tournament actually concludes, and in a succinct 22 chapters no less. Bakugo defeats Todoroki after the latter suppresses his true powers. Though deliberately underwhelming, it's a proper ending to the tournament nonetheless. The Chunin exams only go as far as the quarterfinals before they're interrupted. Orochimaru is introduced as an imposing villain outside of the tournament, just as Stain is foreshadowed during the sports festival. The key difference is that Orochimaru is directly involved with the exams, serving as an end boss similar to Gaara in the arc's climax. Stain, on the other hand, is largely disconnected from the festival, his only impact on the arc being Ida's absence from the awards ceremony. The sports festival doesn't have an overarching antagonist, but instead relies on a variety of mini-bosses. Monoma debuts at the opening ceremony and later gets stomped by Bakugo. Shinso is introduced at the start of the arc as an antagonist to Class A, and he acts as an obstacle for Deku in the first round of one-on-one battles. Todoroki serves as Deku's main rival throughout the tournament, and that pays off in their quarterfinal clash. Bakugo antagonizes everyone, so naturally he, like Deku and Todoroki, gets two standout fights, one against Uraraka and one against Todoroki in the finals. The fights themselves are incredibly brisk, often concluding after an exchange or two. Characters don't waste time warming up or feeling each other out like another shonen. Instead, they immediately go all out, which makes the sense of competition all the more palpable, and the victorious combatant all the more impressive. Beyond that, it also plays into the arc's theme of breeding success through passion. Just as one must desire to be the best to attain that status, one must hold nothing back in these events. The downside to this approach is that, excluding the four important ones, the battles are largely one-dimensional. This is only emphasized by the fact that most of the pairings are blatant mismatches. For example, Tokoyami completely steamrolls his first two opponents in no time flat, but then Bakugo steamrolls him. That might be an effective way of stressing Bakugo's strength, but having that formula repeated throughout 3/4 of the bracket made the viewing experience as a whole kind of underwhelming. Early eliminations like my boy Kaminari and Aoyama are reduced to mere punchlines, and their opponents go on to get eliminated. Did victory or defeat mean anything to them in the big picture? Not really. In fairness though, every tournament needs a few jobbers. Try to put equal emphasis on everyone, and no one stands out. Let's not forget that Naruto had a few squash matches in the preliminaries as well. Hell, the manga straight up skipped Temari vs Tenten, and in all honesty, the anime's take on that fight was just a boring waste of time. Still, I can't help but feel like Horikoshi was just going through the motions at certain parts, especially when you look at the sheer density of the Chunin exams. But before I get to that, I need to lay a little more groundwork. A good tournament requires a large cast of colorful characters, and if there's one thing that these two titles have in common, it's a compelling ensemble cast. The difference with regards to this tournament is that, in Hiroaka, we'd already been exposed to Class A. I wouldn't yet call them well-realized personalities by any stretch, but Horikoshi had done at least some legwork beforehand. In the Naruto manga, the only major characters that had been established were Team 7, and though the anime provides a few teasers early on, the fact remains that Kishimoto had to introduce the majority of this arc's cast in one fell swoop. Team Asuma, Team Kurenai, Team Guy, the Sand Trio, the Sound Trio, Kabuto, one after another these characters appear in just a few chapters. It was a risky move at a point where Kishimoto had otherwise played it fairly safe with his cast, and it's a testament to his ability that he managed to pull this off as well as he did. The sudden influx of new characters would eventually come back to bite him, just as an overly large cast tends to in a long-running story like this. But the new cast was by and large the strongest aspect of the Chunin exams. While Hiroaka immediately puts the spotlight on 3 specific characters and shapes the arc around them, Naruto showcases a bunch of people in varying degrees throughout the exams. Rock Lee humiliates Sasuke, but he later gets punked by the Sound Ninja, who themselves are later outdone by Sasuke, Shino, Shikamaru, and Gaara, the latter of which is continuously built up in the background until he finally takes center stage against Lee in the prelims. Neji takes a back seat until his fight with Hinata, at which point he becomes a minor antagonist for Naruto to overcome. Sakura and Ino get a chance to shine, Kiba has a cool fight against Naruto, Kabuto's alliance with Orochimaru gets set up. This is the sheer density that I referred to earlier. The pecking order is constantly shifting. Conflicts resolved and are replaced with new ones. Naruto takes the tournament format and transforms it into a slow-burning epic full of twists and turns. This is reflected in the preliminary fights, with most battles receiving at least a single chapter, if not multiple. It isn't a perfect story arc, but it nevertheless created an intense atmosphere that can't easily be replicated. Perhaps Horikoshi realized this, because the sports festival is the exact opposite of a slow-burning epic. At the end of the 5th volume of Hiroaka, Horikoshi said, "When I was putting this arc together in my mind, it was going to be a vehicle for Todoroki's development. There'd be 2 chapters for the obstacle race, 1 for the interlude, 2 for the cavalry battle, and about 5 for the tournament itself. But when I started drawing, I realized I needed to showcase all these different characters, so it couldn't be as succinct as I'd imagined." Horikoshi wanted the sports festival to be short, sweet, and to the point, so he designed the event around simple challenges that could be easily explained and worked with. Everyone knows how an obstacle race works. Avoid the obstructions and outpace your opponents. The cavalry battle was an interesting choice, but even then, the goal of securing headbands for points wasn't very complex. Again, Horikoshi initially thought he could wrap things up in just 10 chapters. Though the arc took 22 instead, there's only so much you can do with that mindset. Funnily enough, in that very same volume, Horikoshi mentioned that he had since spoken with Masashi Kishimoto, who told him, "Whenever you make an estimate for the length of an arc, count on it ballooning out to twice that length." If we were to apply that metric to Naruto, this means that Kishimoto may have estimated the Chunin exams would take around 50 chapters to write, which is still more than double that of the completed sports festival. Now, that might be a bit generous considering the editors at Jump somewhere during the process told him to introduce a new villain and cut the tournament short, which in all likelihood caused the arc to be longer than it could have been. But given the details of each exam phase, it's clear that Kishimoto had big ambitions for this tournament from the outset. The written test, for example, had far more going on than the obstacle race. Kishimoto teased new techniques by forcing characters to steal information from other people, which in-universe was a test of each individual's ability to gather intel. Not only that, but their mental fortitude is tested by the commanding officer of the torture and interrogation force. This man doesn't mess around. The test is specifically designed to scare people away from the exam by threatening their future and their comrades' future, putting them into a seemingly no-win scenario where the only escape route would jeopardize everything. But even then, the test is flawed. Naruto fails to answer a single question, fails to gather any outside intel, and yet he passes out of sheer resolve. I won't hide my bias. That's cool. None of the events in the sports festival have a backdoor solution like that. They weren't designed to have that kind of nuance. And while I appreciate the festival for what it does accomplish, I have to give the Chunin exams credit where it's due. Most tournament arcs hinge heavily on the protagonist. In early Dragon Ball, Son Goku competes in all 3 of the Tenkaichi Budokai finals. Naruto's clash with Gaara serves as a sort of pseudo-finale to the Chunin exams. In Hiroaka, however, Deku gets knocked out in the quarter-finals, which is an interesting subversion of expectations, especially when you consider how the narrative seemingly bent over backwards to give Deku the lead after round 1. His fight with Todoroki throws any plot armor typically associated with a shonen lead out the window, at least for this arc, and his crushing defeat forces him to adjust his previously self-destructive approach to combat. The action itself starts off as repetitive and one-dimensional. which mimics the ideological clash of two boys unwilling to budge on their beliefs. Combine that with an extended backstory flashback and a shift in the rivals' perspective, and the parallel to Naruto versus Neji becomes all too obvious. A big difference between the two, however, is the lack of growth on Naruto's part. A resounding win over Neji validates Naruto's philosophy and forces Neji to reject his own. To contrast this, Todoroki compromises on his beliefs rather than rejects them outright. He still dismisses the idea that he is a product of his father, but he learns to accept and use his powers as his own. Deku's actions are called into question as well. The scar on his hand serves as a reminder that he can't keep breaking himself for the sake of others. Not only does he need to control his quirk, but he also needs to restrain his self-sacrificing mindset. As Aizawa-sensei once said, he'd be useless if he became incapacitated after saving just one person. He might still die a hero that way, but he'd ultimately accomplish much less than he potentially could. Like with Todoroki, this isn't an outright rejection of his beliefs, but another compromise. Now, while I do believe that the Neji-Naruto dynamic could have been executed much better, I'm not saying that Naruto needed to compromise with Neji. I just found the Deku-Todoroki fight more interesting. At the end of the day, the sports festival is brief, exciting, but sort of hollow. And while that certainly plays into Bakugo's empty victory, it hardly increases the memorability of this arc. The fights get straight to the point, the power dynamics between characters is logical, and the action is bombastic when it needs to be, especially in animation. But from a narrative standpoint, the Chunin exams completely outclass it in scale. The very foundation of the tournament required it to do so. In Naruto, the characters want to become Chunin, a rank which requires a tremendous level of technique and survival skills. The characters are pushed to their breaking points because that is the nature of their desired profession. The Chunin exams are described as a war in miniature between the great nations, a secluded deathmatch, if you will, while the sports festival is a broadcast spectacle. Because of this, the tone of the Chunin exams is much more serious. There will be another sports festival. Deku's classmates will get another opportunity to prove themselves. But while there will also be more Chunin exams, there's no guarantee that the participants will make it out of this one unscathed. The proctors of the sports festival will step in before any significant damage occurs. And while those of the Chunin exams may do the same, that doesn't mean that death is an impossibility. If nothing else, I have to give Kishimoto credit for how ambitious the Chunin exams were. His initial plan was to introduce each new squad individually over the course of several arcs, but when his editors told him to go with a tournament, he was forced to introduce them en masse. But even in spite of that, I'm amazed at how well he was able to characterize this massive cast without destroying the arc's overall pacing. Each new edition has a distinct design and personality to match, even if they lack the substance of a Naruto or Sasuke. Unfortunately, that's also part of the problem with the Chunin exams. While this arc crafts a compelling narrative and sets up a multitude of interesting characters that could be expanded on in future arcs, most of that potential is never realized. Gaara vs. Rock Lee might be one of the best fights in the series, but Lee never reaches the same level of importance again. Shino is built up to be an ominous threat, yet he completely disappears after this. This arc was incredible, truly one of the best that the series had to offer. But Kishimoto ultimately bit off just a bit more than he could chew. To contrast this, the sports festival minimizes its reach to focus on a few core ideas. By doing this, Horikoshi avoids the same problem that Kishimoto encountered, that of doing too many things at once. But as a result of this smaller scope, the tournament lacks the same long-lasting impact that the Chunin exams had. Much like the characters that he creates, Horikoshi's vision for this arc was a simplistic one. Perhaps too simplistic. At times, it can feel as if the sports festival is accomplishing the bare minimum that a traditional tournament arc requires. Characters fight, but outside of the aforementioned key players, no one gets much time to shine or develop. So while the three-way feud between Deku, Todoroki, and Bakugo was entertaining, and a few others like Shinso and Uraraka had moments to shine, I would have liked to see a bit more from those squash matches. They aren't awful due to the blink and you'll miss it pacing, and I honestly believe that said pacing is one of the arc's core strengths. But I also would have liked to see Horikoshi throw an extra bone or two to the supporting cast. Some people love this arc, and though I did enjoy it a lot, I doubt I'll be calling it one of the best in the series. That title currently goes to my boy Stain. For anyone who's curious about how a more simplistic Chunin exams would play out, I highly recommend the Boruto movie. Size test serves basically the same purpose as the written exam, only with less nuance. The second phase is just capture the flag, as opposed to capture the flag on steroids, and this exam also ends prematurely. It's fairly bare bones, since it was written for a film rather than a long-running manga, and on top of that, it is designed around Boruto and his feelings of frustration and inadequacy exclusively. In saying that though, it's not a bad tournament. Sure, compared to the original Chunin exams, and even the sports festival, there's just nothing to it. But in the context of the film, it accomplished exactly what it was designed to. It explored Boruto's internal conflict, and the means he was willing to stoop to if it meant gaining recognition from his father. I use this example to reiterate what I've been trying to convey in this video. You can compare things like this all you want, but no matter how many similarities you can find, you're ultimately comparing apples to oranges. So instead of striving to define who did what better, consider what the arc did and didn't accomplish in the context of its story, and use that to determine its value. So, which tournament arc do I prefer? That's an easy one. The Hunter exam. Special thanks to the glorious folks who support me on Patreon, including King Kevin 30, Micah Dunn, Stone Cold 007, and India Charbonneau. If you'd like to hear me discuss Naruto in more depth, check out the Nen Show podcast, where I joined Craftsdwarf in revisiting the story through the original manga. If you'd rather something shorter, check out my analysis of the Naruto soundtrack. Until next time, keep on YouTubing.